Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I'm just getting ready to feed my red wiggler bins. I've got 4 of them. Well, one of them's got a mix of other types of worms in there too, but it's mostly red wigglers. And the bins that I'm talking about that I want to feed today are 2 lower ones on the ground. There's the one directly above them on the left over there, not the other 2 next to it, just the one on the left on the middle row there, and then the one all the way up on the top right. This over here is African night crawlers. These down here are night crawlers. Those are night crawlers. This bin is actually red wigglers too, but they're being handled a little differently right now. They're migrating out of the finished compost. So this is just a routine feeding for all of my other bins. And what's on the menu for today? A whole bunch of leaves from radishes, some raspberry that had gone bad, a little bit of coffee, as well as a couple filters, and that's pretty much it. Not a lot of food, just going to give a little bit to each bin. Ain't going to be much of a big feeding, but at least they'll keep them going for another week or so. So let's get to work on this. A lot of times we'll begin with my oldest bins, but I think on this go around I figured let's start with the youngest. And I didn't really come down here with any notes prepared to talk about how old each bin is and how many feedings it's received. I just kind of grabbed a few things from the kitchen, shot down here to feed these guys. I was not intending to take a great deal of time. So this is kind of a early stage of the worms starting to feel comfortable here on the top. Might actually be the first time I've seen worms hanging out on the top of this particular piece of paper, which you might be able to tell is still pretty new. It hardly has any castings dropped onto it. Get out of here, guys. It's for their own good. I want to remove the paper, get it out of our way. And I think they're just better off in the bin rather than being set aside over in the dry. Let's get this feeding zone indicator out of here too, indicating to us where we last fed, which was a week ago today. 7 days since this bin was last fed, and if I remember correctly, we didn't really feed a whole lot then either. So we're going to give them all a little bit again today. Might not be all that much, but better than nothing. Another thing I'm adding is grit here. I don't think I mentioned that earlier. So the feedings will include coffee, veggies and fruits, and a little bit of coarse ground up eggshell to serve as their grit to go with their food. This has only, I don't know, been fed once before, twice before. This is a fairly new bin. And I kind of had this impression from our last check-in that it was not a very heavily populated bin. But we're getting a pretty nice little welcoming party over here. And I might just have been mistaken about how many worms are in this container, because it does seem pretty nicely populated. Maybe I was just under the incorrect impression that it isn't. Let's get them out of the hole. As far as bedding is concerned, I don't know, I don't have much here. I bought down a couple coffee filters so we can use one of these as a little bit of bedding to place it underneath the feeding area. Fairly new bin like this clearly has a ton of bedding in it already that has yet to be broken down, so we're certainly in no situation as far as not having enough bedding, that's for sure. So this isn't going to be much of a huge feeding. I'm going to try to do it in a way that makes this stuff last for all 4 bins. So I'm not even sure. Hopefully I'm divvying this up accurately. But you know, since I did have a hunch that this bag might not be so heavily populated, maybe we'll go back on what our gut instinct said and make sure we've got enough for some of the more densely populated bins that I have to feed today. Yeah, this stuff is developing a little bit of mold, getting a little bit disgusting. So we'll see how we fare here, giving out each bin about an equal amount. Okay. The bin looks really nice. There's good dampness because that plastic I've been using to cover up with does seem to go all the way out to the edges. Last week I came in here with the spray bottle and I sprayed a little bit of water in here after I got this sense that the material in here might be a little bit too dry, but I'm not feeling that now. I'm feeling like the material is getting a nice moisture level to it. And a little bit of water probably would not hurt much. But I've also heard how, you know, if the material is a little bit more coarse and dry, it might also have its benefits. I forget what it is exactly, what the benefit to it being that way was, but I'm just zeroing in on a couple pieces of what I believe are plantain, little banana type fruits over here. I figured I would just move them to the center, keep them where all the rest of the food is. All right, not bad. I like what I'm seeing here. Let's get everything covered up again the way we found it. And move on to the next bin, which is not purely red wigglers, as far as I know. I believe it actually has 3 different breeds of worms in it. Red wigglers, European night crawlers, and blues, Indian blues. So let's get that one out here and see how that one's doing. All right, here, very similar setup. I believe we've got a very similar setup in all of them. We have a light barrier, a moisture barrier, which is just a plastic bag, not allowing for evaporation. I usually have some sort of a piece of paper under that, where I think is kind of like the landing pad for a lot of the moisture. Sometimes before the worms kind of discover it, it gets very puddly. But once the worms figure out that it's there, you don't see little puddles like you do on other systems, maybe the worms just haven't taken a shine to going up onto the paper yet. But it eventually happens in each bin, and it's kind of fun, you know, having a little bit of a welcoming party there in the beginning. A couple more worms kind of exhibiting some less than perfect appearance, like some of these chunks of worms. I think these are just pieces of worms, not even an entire worm. I think some people were saying, or at least one person mentioned, that that's maybe due to a deficiency in carbon. But I mean, I've definitely got enough bedding and carbon in this bin. It's you know, I guess the person also said you can't force them to eat a balanced diet. But maybe you know, maybe that's the reason. Some worms are looking that way. At least that was the impression I got. There's one possible explanation. So once in a while, I'm seeing some unusual stuff in this bin with not so healthy looking worms. We'll have to see where all that leads. Here we didn't have the marker, so we can grab a new one and place it in here after we've done feeding. Sometimes I just like to show where I last fed. One thing I was thinking about doing during this feeding is taking the newest bin, which we just fed, and I didn't do it. So one thing we could do is sometimes alter the pattern of feeding, because in most of my bins, if you haven't noticed, I feed down the middle in most cases. But I've done other feeding patterns in the past where I've actually moved the worms from corner to corner, always feeding in a different spot, kind of forcing them to keep moving around, not feeding them in the same spot all the time the way I do. Although technically what I fed last week will get pushed out, and what was fed the week before that was pushed out even further. So in a way, I feel like I do have almost distinguishable regions of where the previous feedings were. But I was thinking maybe we would try that pocket feeding in one of my bins. Might as well do it here. I think I had actually talked about maybe doing it in my newest bin, the one we already took care of. But I'll typically not want to double back and undo something I did. So that one got, it's feeding down the middle again like I've been doing in most places. But here we can relocate the feeding area. This is my second oldest bin, so it's got some time to go. We'll have a few weeks, a few more feedings to maybe try a little pattern to the feeding. And I mean, I don't know what other methods there are, but the main pocket that I've seen is, I guess, that pocket feeding where you know, consider your bin as almost being like a billiard table, and that the pockets are either just the corners, or the pockets could even be here on the side like you see on a pool table, billiard table. So in a way, we can almost just say we've already fed down in the middle zone, if we're actually going to use those middle ones, or if we could just use the corners only. It doesn't matter. It's totally whatever you want to do. So maybe maybe we'll treat it as the two middle ones already being taken care of with feedings in the last couple feedings. And now we're just going to go visit all the different four corners of the bin and relocate the feeding from corner to corner over the next few feedings. And I guess the simplest way to do it is just to go clockwise. So I'll start up here, top right. We'll use that as the area to put the food into. So we'll put all of the old food chunks we found while rummaging around. Make sure that they get placed down there as well, along with the fresh food that they're getting. I do see, you know, fair bits of carbon-based stuff in here, paper scraps and chunks of leaves all over the place. So I don't think that there's any sort of a distinct shortage of carbon in this bin. I think it's like that person said in the comments section, that if it is sort of an imbalance where they're just not consuming enough carbon, it's, you know, not much you could do about that, I guess. If they don't want to, they're not gonna. So we've done a pretty nice job sort of tilling up the entire bin at this point, looking all over the place, checking out different stuff. But we'll use this corner here to place today's feeding into. I've got one more of these filters, so why don't we use that here. Let's drop in a few. Don't want to forget about all these old chunks of food that they've been working on for a while now. Looks like maybe banana peel and the stem of a banana peel. They're definitely making a good effort at breaking it all down. Well, we don't have to go crazy. That's probably good enough right there. Just place the old food on the bottom, place the new food on the top. Let's give this bin a nice couple bunches of these leaves too. Just a little twist from what I usually do. Usually I'll freeze, but this stuff is not out of my freezer. It's just off the back porch, and it did go down to freezing temperatures last night. So who knows? It might be possible that this stuff, it did actually freeze overnight last night outside in the cold. But let's make sure we don't give all the food away. We've still got a couple bins that we want to feed. Take one or two back, make sure the other bins get a fair portion. I don't even know why I bother with that sort of thinking though, because the worms aren't keeping track of what they got compared to what the neighbors got, right? So it's not like I'm going to be hurting anyone's feelings. Strange. Just this weird kind of superimposing human thinking and requirements onto completely different beings. The worms are definitely not human, nor do they have the requirements that we do when it comes to those sort of little things. They're just happy to get fed, I think. Okay, so now this is where it's going to come in handy, because once you cover up like this, after you've fed in a corner, one corner looks a lot like all the other corners. It's kind of hard to tell that you actually fed without marking it, although that's not entirely true either. We're going to come back here in a week and we're going to know exactly where the feeding occurred, because this corner is going to be completely collapsed down and much smaller than it is now, because of the fact that the worms are gobbling up all the yummy stuff right below it. All right. This guy went for a ride. Whatever. He'll be fine right there where he is. Okay. Seems like we're making pretty good progress. Still don't understand why I'm occasionally seeing such weird things happening in this bin as far as like worms breaking in half for whatever reason, but I don't know. We'll see where that leads. On to the next bin. Okay, so up next is what used to be, I don't know if it still is, but what had been considering to be my most heavily populated bin. It was this bin that I obtained volunteer worms out of when I populated my newest bin, the one that we just fed in the beginning. But even after I cleared out a number of worms out of this container, it still seemed to be a very busy space with lots of worms doing a great job breaking it all down. So I'm certain whatever I give these guys is going to get gobbled up pretty quickly. I'll be curious to see how many leftovers we find from previous feedings, although everything we found so far, there was half of an avocado, those pieces of banana stems, things like that. So far, the only types of leftovers that we have found are ones that we know are going to track back many weeks, because they do take time to break down. I couldn't really make sense of any leftovers from the previous feeding, or I couldn't really identify anything that appeared to be clearly from the previous feeding. And I think that's probably going to be the same thing we're going to see in all these bins. But I could be wrong. Certain things like these plantain chunks, these go back many weeks at this point. Maybe 3 feedings. So, do we want to modify the feeding pattern in this bin too? We certainly could. Let all these worms right down here in the middle just continue breaking down all this loose little tiny stuff that we haven't fished out, and then maybe set up their new feeding area in one of the corners. So I might as well stick to a good pattern, right? It looks like we've been working the middle pretty good so far, so we won't worry so much about setting up the feeding area in the middle pockets. We'll stick to the corner pockets only. And I guess like we did before, we'll go for this corner over here. Let's excavate ourselves a little space for this to be. Definitely not as many worms hanging out over here. They're clearly distracted by the big bounty of food in the middle of the bin. This is where they're going to get the next portion applied. So I'm sure next week this corner is going to be a little different with a lot more worms in it. Here too we've got leaves. Even some chunks of radish for this one. Drop in a couple berries, saving a few for the oldest bin. Although I think with this bin being possibly the more heavily populated one, I got a feeling that this bin is actually going to bypass the progress of the oldest bin. And you can tell just by looking at these castings, there's like almost nothing left within it. It's just almost pure castings anymore, you know, other than stuff I've mixed into it myself. So I wouldn't be surprised if this was the next bin I decide to harvest, just based on the fact that it's just blazing forward with a good large population of worms. So I do definitely enjoy composting with large populations of worms. Just so much fun. So cool just picking around through their bin and seeing how many of them there are, especially in the feeding area. So let's make sure we mark the feeding area before we lose track of where it was. That'll be done with this feeding zone indicator. All right. But we've looked around in most every other bin, so why don't we just treat ourselves to a little glimpse at what's happening out here on this edge. I'm more concerned just about making sure that there's no overly dry conditions starting to happen out on the far edges. Just kind of a force of habit too, because I don't really have that anymore with the plastic bag coverings that I use nowadays. And it's not even that new thing anymore. It's been about a year now since I adopted the use of these plastic covers, but up until that time I always struggled with my bins just drying out and becoming, to me, seemingly inhospitable to the worms. So I would always be applying water, squirting water on there and everything. Sometimes I'd actually take other bins and place them over the top to create like a lid to try to prevent evaporation. Then I just got smart and I started using the plastic bags to cover up, and it's just so simple that way, and it works so well too. So let's get this bin buttoned up and back up on the shelf. Very nice progress in here, but you know that this bin's going to do away with that food in no time. It's going to be a quick meal for them. So I'm sure I'll be back down here at least in a week's time, maybe sooner, who knows. All right, one last bin to go. All right, last but not least, we've got the oldest of my red wiggler bins, which I don't think, at least as of last week, did not seem to have as nice castings as the last bin that we just fed. That's why I think that last bin that we just fed is probably, I don't know, somehow doing a little bit better than this one. Maybe it just doesn't have quite as many worms in it. Not to say that there's anything wrong with this bin. Sometimes you do just sort of find yourself comparing them to each other, making sort of assumptions on certain things. So I think with this one I was just maybe somehow expecting it to make, you know, a better paste than it's making now. I don't know. Something about it just makes me feel like it's not as quick productive as it could be. But I could just be sort of misperceiving that. I don't really have a good measure for that. It's just that gut feeling sort of thing. The material in here looks really nice. Fresh castings all around. You can tell just from looking at it that it's pretty damp. It's all just got this nice kind of damp sheen to it. So I'm wondering how things in here look. I'm already catching glimpses of little bits and pieces of what must have been the last feeding. Can't quite remember what it was that I had placed in here as the feeding last time. But I must admit it does have a little bit of an odor to it. I could tell from the color, the purple color, that it's still that fairly large chunk of cabbage. And I thought I had kind of done what I'm doing here, which is sort of poking my finger through each large piece of cabbage, trying to sort of increase its surface area so you don't have anything that has this sort of mass to it, where the inside of it is just not getting penetrated yet. So I think by doing this, we've given this food a much greater chance of getting broken down a lot more quickly than if we hadn't. So we'll just take whatever we find as far as leftovers, pile them up over there in the corner, so we can keep track of them a little bit more easily. And what else we're going to find in here? Definitely finding that it's a little bit more moist than the other bins were down in the feeding area. Probably doesn't matter so much, because you know it's going to result in good composting activity. Keep the bin nice and cozy and damp the way the worms like it, and chances are you're going to get a good outcome. This stem though, man, this stem is so hard. It's like rock hard. It's been in here for quite a while now, a number of weeks. Just wondering when it's finally going to start breaking down. Everything else that I'm touching here seems to be such that I can either just break it with my fingertips or at least poke my finger through it with minimal effort, except for that one stem. Okay, I'm getting a little confused with which bin I fed how. I'm wondering, do we take the same approach here? We were doing a nice little pocket feeding pattern there. The only one that missed out so far was the newest bin. So maybe next go around, if we remember to do it, we'll try to pocket feed that one and start maybe pocket feeding all the red wigglers to see what we get. Maybe even just go one full round, you know, go 4 weeks or 4 feedings, whatever, until such a time that you've hit each 4 corner. And then that other bin, that newest bin, will have time to catch up since it is the youngest of them all. So, I like that idea. Why don't we do that? We're going to shove some of this leftover food down here so we can keep track of it. As far as bedding is concerned, I've used up all the bedding I came down here with, but I did manage to collect a fair bit of it over here. You might have noticed me piling up these paper scraps over here in the corner. So I think we found enough bedding that we can have a little something to lay down in under the feeding area. Although, you know, when you look at this feeding, this go around, these radish leaves almost come across as a bedding in a way. I mean, they're definitely still green. They're probably rich in nitrogen, not like they're totally dry leaves you have in the yard in the autumn time. I'm sure there's still some carbon content to something that's this green or that's this fresh. So I don't have much carbon to complement the feeding with other than what I salvaged and piled up over here. So we'll combine all that together. I'm trying to remember now, did the other bins get grit and coffee? Seems like everything's running out at an equal pace. Oops, spilled a little bit there. Don't look too bad. All right, so piling in all these old food scraps right on top of that should give it a good amount of traffic, hopefully. I wonder how this stem is going to do, how long it's going to take to break down. It's taking quite a while. Okay. Interesting. Haven't done this in a while. And it starts to make a little more sense as to why you're actually marking where you fed. If you always feed in the same spot, then why bother marking it? You know exactly where to find the last feeding if you go looking for it. So I'm finally putting my feeding zone indicators to work for a change, with actually having a purpose anymore. Alright, I just figured I'd do a little bit more rummaging around, a little airing out of the material where we hadn't really looked around quite yet. The other corners that are going to get fed in the future check-ins. And, you know, even though things do seem a little bit damp down in here, I don't mind keeping it that way, because otherwise stuff like this, these old leaf sticks, I think they need a good amount of moisture to eventually become soft enough so they could be nibbled away at. If things are too dry, they're just going to sit there. The worms are never going to be able to make any progress with them. So for now, even though this is my oldest bin, I don't know if I'm going to be driving this one to completion first, or if maybe the other bin we just fed is going to sort of catch up and bypass it. Maybe that one will be the one that's ready for harvest sooner than this one. So, oops, almost out of force of habit, put the feeding zone indicator in the wrong spot. We did feed in that corner, I think. See, I'm forgetting already. Good thing I'm marking these things. Alright, so not much left to do here. We've got all of our 4 red wiggler bins fed. Not a huge feeding, so I assume within another week's time we'll be back down here to feed them again. So hopefully we'll see you then, if not sooner. I hope so. Okay, that was fun, but we almost got a little problem here with this worm hanging out on my fingertip. Let's not cut to the end until we know all of our little friends are where they need to be in a safe spot. Alright, now I think we're in a good shape to call it a day. Alright everyone, hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, also consider subscribing to the channel too, because that's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.